On December 7th, 1993, a pregnant woman named Diane Schaap sat inside of a hospital room in the city of Fulda, Germany, staring anxiously at the nurse who was doing her blood pressure. When the nurse was done, she would tell Diane that her blood pressure was still too high. And so Diane, she sighed and she was pretty upset by this, but at the same time, she wasn't all that shocked. After all, Diane had come to the hospital because she thought something was wrong with her. Diane was an American who lived on the nearby Sickles Army Airfield Base along with her husband, Sergeant Stephen Schaap. And that morning, Diane had begun to bleed, and because she had a history of miscarriages, she panicked and just rushed to the hospital to get checked out. Now, ultimately, the doctors would tell her that it seemed like she was going to be okay and that the bleeding was not a big issue, but as a precaution, they wanted her to stay in the hospital for a week, just doing bed rest, where they could watch her and make sure she was really okay. And so far, she was, but her blood pressure was still too high. The nurse who had taken Diane's blood pressure finished doing the rest of Diane's vitals, and then afterwards, she left the room, leaving Diane alone. And Diane, now, it's the first time she's been alone inside of her hospital room since she arrived, and suddenly she just felt so anxious about the whole situation. And so as she's laying in her bed, wondering if her pregnancy was really okay, she heard footsteps out in the hallway, and then suddenly her door busted open, and it was her husband, Stephen. And Stephen, his skin was pale, his eyes were red, he looked really upset, and he rushed into the room and he kneeled down next to Diane's bed and he took her hand and he just said, how are you doing? It had been a really hard stretch lately for Diane and Stephen. Just a few months earlier, Diane had actually asked Stephen for a divorce because she felt like Stephen had grown distant and the love was just not there anymore in their relationship. As for Stephen, he didn't want the divorce. He felt like the relationship was still good, they still loved each other, but he understood Diane was clearly unhappy, and so he was very gentlemanly about this whole situation, and even went with Diane to the base's cleric, where they arranged for Diane to be sent back to the United States while Stephen stayed in Germany. But before Diane was able to make that move back home, she had discovered that she was pregnant. Now, Diane knew Stephen really wanted to reconcile and get back together, and especially now that he had found out she was pregnant, he really wanted them to get back together so he could be the dad. But Diane knew that just was not possible. Their relationship just didn't work, and so she needed to be firm, and so she actually squeezed Stephen's hand as he's sitting there right next to her, and she just said to him, even though he hadn't brought it up, she said, we can't get back together, even though I'm pregnant. It can't happen. But Stephen just kind of shook his head at her like he was not here for that reason. And he said, look, I just want to be your friend. Let me go back to your house. I'll gather up your things and bring them here to make your stay a little bit more comfortable. And so Diane, who wanted to tell Stephen, no, don't do that. I'm fine. She could just tell that he really wanted to help her. And so kind of against her better judgment, Diane said, okay, Stephen, if you want to go back and get my stuff, I would really appreciate it. And at that, Stephen stood up and he gave Diane a long hug and said, I'll be right back. And then he turned and left the room. A few hours later, at around 5 p.m. that evening, the phone inside of Diane's room began to ring. And so Diane answered it, and it was her husband's best friend, Gregory Glover. And he was calling just to check in on Diane because he had heard she was in the hospital about some bleeding, and he wanted to make sure the baby was okay. And Diane would tell him that, it seems like everything's fine. And then after that, Gregory would tell Diane that he was really worried about Stephen. He said, this morning I had driven him to work, and all he did was pour his heart out to me about how he wanted to get back together with you. And I just want you to know that, he's really worked up about this. But before Diane could even respond to Gregory, the phone just suddenly went dead. And so Diane, she held the phone out, kind of staring at it like, what's going on here? She put it back to her ear. She said Greg's name a few more times, but the line was just totally dead. And so Diane, she hung up the phone and figured Gregory would just call back. But 30 minutes went by and Gregory did not call back. And then out in the hallway, Diane began to hear running. And that running continued all the way up the hall and it stopped right outside of her door. And so she turned to face her door, the door flung open, and what she saw caused Diane to just freeze in total shock. A few hours earlier, after Stephen had left Diane's hospital room, he had gone straight to her house to begin gathering things up for her. And so when he got there, he had a gym bag, which was made by a sports and athletic company called Head, and he had gone inside of her house and begun going around the rooms, gathering things she would want and putting them in this bag. And at some point, Stephen made his way into Diane's bedroom, and suddenly he was just kind of overcome with sadness because he looked around the room and he saw there were still pictures up from their wedding day, and there was a card that was face down on the bedside table that he recognized. And just all of these different things he was seeing just suddenly made him feel so depressed about losing his marriage. And so Stephen, instead of continuing to gather up things for Diane, he just began pacing back and forth inside of her bedroom, thinking about ways he could potentially win Diane back. Maybe there was a gift he could give her or some sort of offering or gesture that would show her that he still loved her very much. And so as Stephen was thinking about this, he happened to glance down at his gym bag, and suddenly he felt totally inspired, like he knew exactly what he needed to do. And so without another thought, Stephen grabbed something off of the mantelpiece inside of Diane's bedroom, he threw it inside of his gym bag, then he grabbed the bag and walked out of her house. Once Stephen was outside, he had a big smile on his face, he was even whistling as he walked, and he went down and he got into his car and he drove off. But instead of going to the hospital where Diane was, Stephen began driving in these weird loops all around Sickles Army Airfield Base, almost like he was going on a joyride. But as he was driving, Stephen was constantly scanning left and right, like he was looking for something. And then at some point, as he did one of his many loops, Stephen passed by the mess hall, the cafeteria, and he saw all the soldiers going in and out of this mess hall, and he thought, oh, that's where it will be. The thing I need is inside of there. And so Stephen, he parked his car, he got out, and he rushed inside of the mess hall, but after looking all around, he couldn't find the thing he wanted. And so frustrated, he turned and walked out of the mess hall. But when he went back outside, as he was walking back to his car, something out of the corner of his eye caught his attention, and he looked over, and it was this phone booth right on the sidewalk up against the road. And he couldn't believe it, but there it was. There was the thing right near this phone booth that Stephen desperately wanted. And so Stephen, instead of going to his car, just began walking in a straight, very determined line towards this phone booth. 30 minutes later, Diane heard those running footsteps out in the hallway, and then her door flung open and she froze in shock at what she saw. Because what she saw was her husband, and he had this totally crazed look on his face, like he was smiling, but kind of deranged, and he was holding that head gym bag. And he walked in holding the bag and just stared directly at Diane, and then he opened it up, he reached inside, and he pulled out his special gift. The thing he had been driving all around base for that he had found inside of that phone booth, and he walked up to Diane and he put it right in her face and said, look what I brought you, look. And by this point, Diane was screaming bloody murder. It would turn out when Stephen first arrived at Diane's hospital room that morning and he had knelt down and taken her hand and asked if she was okay, Diane had been very firm with him that they could still not get back together even though she was pregnant. Now, this was crushing news for Stephen because he did secretly hope that this baby would bring them back together, but what Diane told Stephen next was infinitely more crushing. She would say to Stephen that the real reason they could not get back together was because this baby was not his. Now, Stephen had initially taken this news pretty well and said to Diane, okay, I understand, at least let me go to your house and gather up some things for you and bring them back here so your stay at the hospital is a little bit more comfortable. And Diane had maybe been a little bit surprised at how well Stephen had taken this, and she said, okay, yeah, that would be great. And so Stephen had left the hospital, gone to Diane's house, he went into her room, and he began putting her things into that gym bag when suddenly he stopped because he noticed those pictures on the mantelpiece of their wedding day, and it was just kind of crushing to realize that his marriage really was over. And then, before he went back to packing, he happened to glance over at the bedside table, and he noticed a card face down on that table. Now, at first, Stephen actually didn't really react to this card because he knew who had given it to Diane. It was just a friend of hers, and the card was kind of meaningless. It was just a card to celebrate their friendship. But then Stephen's suddenly thinking to himself, wait a minute. This person, this friend of Diane's, gives her cards all the time. And this person is always coming over to say hi to Diane. And this person's always complimenting Diane and telling me how great Diane is. And it was like suddenly everything just kind of fell into place for Stephen, and he realized this so-called friend of Diane's was much more than that. This friend was Diane's lover and very likely the father of her unborn child. And who was this friend of Diane's? Well, none other than Stephen's very best friend, Gregory Glover. The same Gregory Glover that Stephen just that morning had poured his heart out to on the ride to work, telling Gregory how much he missed his wife and how much he wanted to reconcile. And Gregory's advice to Stephen had been, well, I know you're hurting, but you really need to let this go. You need to let the divorce happen and just move on with your life. And now Stephen realized that Gregory wanted Stephen to end his relationship with his wife so Gregory could have a relationship with Diane. And so Stephen felt unbelievably betrayed, and that was when he decided to get a gift for Diane. And so he grabbed a knife that was on the mantelpiece inside of Diane's bedroom. He threw it inside of his gym bag. He got in his car and he began driving around the base looking for Gregory. And after Stephen had gone into the mess hall and then come back out again, he had spotted Gregory on the phone inside of that phone booth. And Stephen had immediately run over, opened it up, grabbed Gregory, pulled him out, and begun stabbing him. Now, Stephen didn't know this, but at the time he attacked Greg was literally on the phone with Diane. And so when that call suddenly dropped and Diane expected Gregory to call her back, well, their call really hadn't dropped. It was just that Gregory had been pulled away and was being attacked. Gregory, who was totally caught off guard, tried his best to defend himself against Stephen, but Stephen was just crazed and he kept hacking away until finally Gregory had stopped moving. And then at some point, Stephen stood up and kind of caught his breath and he's looking around at all these onlookers who can't believe what they're seeing. And Stephen said, "I'm sorry." He grabbed some things off the ground, put them inside of his head bag, and then he took the bag, he ran to his car, drove to the hospital, ran through the hospital to Diane's room. He flung the door open and Diane is shocked to see him. And Stephen walks in with this crazed look on his face and he holds up the bag, he unzips it and pulls out Gregory's severed head. And he holds it right in front of Diane and says, look what I brought you, look. And he placed it down right on the bedside table, looking directly at Diane. And so Diane began screaming and people began rushing into the room. Meanwhile, Stephen just sat in the corner calmly, waiting to be arrested. Ultimately, Stephen would be tried by a military court and he would be sentenced to life in prison. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Snowball Effect. On the evening of December 20th, 2022, a young woman named Moon Soo-ho, along with her boyfriend, whose name was Lee Ki-young, sat at a table at a Korean barbecue restaurant in northern Seoul, which is the capital city of South Korea. The couple didn't even have any food yet, but Moon was not even looking at the menu. Instead, she was excitedly checking her watch, waiting for her parents to arrive. This dinner was a very special occasion for Moon because she had been dating Lee for several months now and she was totally in love with him, but she had not introduced him to her parents yet. And so Lee had surprised her with reservations to this restaurant tonight for 4 people. He had invited her parents to come to the dinner so they could all finally meet. Moon looked across the table at Lee and she smiled because she knew as soon as her parents saw this guy, they were going to be impressed. Lee was a 32-year-old Army veteran with lots of crazy stories from his time in the military. He was also exceptionally good-looking, he was very well-educated, and he came from a family that was extremely successful and very wealthy. Lee's grandfather owned the high-rise building that Lee was staying in. I mean, this family was very influential and powerful in South Korea. But Lee was not full of himself. He was very humble, he was kind and polite, and he had a total soft spot for little animals. He had adopted a dog and 3 cats and adored them. I mean, this was a guy who was kind of like the total package that any parent would be psyched that their daughter was dating. After Moon and Lee had been sitting at this table for about 15 minutes, Moon looked up and she saw her parents finally coming in the door. And so Moon, she stood up and she waved to her parents and flagged them over to the table. And so they came over, they said hi to Lee. And right away, Lee, he picked up the menu and he ordered all these very expensive drinks and all the expensive meats on the menu. And then before long, Lee was chatting with Moon's father about his military service. And then Lee was talking to Moon's mother and showing her pictures of his dog and his 3 cats. And Moon, she was just sitting back enjoying watching this because she could see from her parents' facial expressions that they seemed to really like Lee too. And so this night was going as good as it could have. Moon and Lee and Moon's parents stayed at this restaurant for at least 2 hours, just enjoying each other's company and throwing back a lot of drinks and eating expensive food. And by the end of the night, when the parents got up to leave, they were like hugging Lee and slapping him on the back and telling him how great he was. And Lee was doing the same thing to the parents. It was like really they had hit it off. But after Moon's parents were gone, Moon and Lee, they left the restaurant too, and they began walking across the street towards the parking garage where Lee had parked. And right away, Moon could tell Lee was actually pretty drunk. She had not noticed it in the restaurant, but now she could see Lee was kind of stumbling a little bit. But Moon wasn't upset about this. If anything, she just thought, wow, he was so composed talking to my parents in there, despite obviously being drunk. He had just managed to mask it really, really well. But despite how impressed she was with her boyfriend, Moon didn't want Lee to drive them home. It seemed like that would be really unsafe to do because, again, obviously he is drunk. And so when Lee and Moon made it to Lee's car, Moon kind of gently told Lee, hey, why don't we leave your car here and just call a taxi and they can take us home safely. But when she said this, Lee took it as if Moon was criticizing him for being too drunk. And he felt really offended because in his mind, he had just put on this great date and made this great first impression on Moon's parents. And here she is kind of nagging him. And so Lee just kind of blew his lid and the couple got in this horrible yelling fight in the parking garage, which ended with Lee telling Moon that their relationship was now over. And then Lee turned around and stormed off to hail a cab by himself. And after he was gone, Moon just stood there next to Lee's car being totally shocked at what had just happened. And then kind of in a daze, she went and hailed a cab herself and went home. And then she just laid in bed and cried until she went to sleep. But Moon was not heartbroken for long because the next morning when Moon woke up, she heard a knock on the front door. And when she opened it up, there was a delivery guy with this huge, beautiful bouquet of roses for Moon. And so Moon took these roses and quickly found a card attached to the roses. She opened it up and there was a letter from Lee saying, please accept these roses as a part of my apology. Last night didn't go so well. I'm really sorry. Please come to dinner with me tonight. Moon was so relieved to get this apology letter that she called Lee right away and said, you know what? I do forgive you. It's all water under the bridge. My parents, they loved you and they have no idea about that fight we had. So let's just put it behind us and just continue being boyfriend and girlfriend. And at this point, it was Lee's turn to be totally relieved because he didn't know if Moon would want him back. But they were back together, and that night they went out for a fancy dinner together, and then also Lee had booked a very fancy hotel room that night for them to stay in. And this is really how their relationship went for the next couple of days. Basically, Lee would take Moon out shopping anywhere she wanted to go. They went to all the best restaurants and stayed in the best hotels. To Moon, it was obvious that Lee was really just continuing to shower her with gifts and praise and all these fun things to still try to make up for that big fight they got into, even though Moon really had forgiven him. And at some point, after several days of being treated like a princess by Lee, Moon finally told Lee, stop buying me stuff. It's fine. I totally forgive you. Everything is good. But Lee insisted that he be allowed to continue to spoil her. After all, it was the Christmas season and she deserved to be spoiled around Christmas. So in South Korea, Christmas is celebrated a bit differently than it is in Western countries like America. In South Korea, Christmas is a big holiday, but it's really just a holiday for couples. It's not really a family occasion. So in South Korea, on Christmas, lots of couples will go out on these fancy dates. And so that's kind of how they celebrate Christmas. Whereas, in Western countries like America, it's all about family and waking up and getting presents from Santa Claus. So that's the difference. Western is family-centric, and in South Korea, it's very couple-centric. It's kind of like Valentine's Day in the winter. So, on Christmas Eve, Lee told Moon that he had a very special dinner planned for Christmas, and would Moon mind coming over to Lee's apartment on Christmas morning to feed his cats and his dog because Lee was going to be out running errands in preparation for this big Christmas dinner. And of course, Moon said she would. So, at around 11 a.m. on Christmas Day, Moon hopped off the elevator inside of Lee's apartment building and began walking down the hall towards his door, carrying the key to his door. But as Moon walked closer and closer to Lee's door, she began smelling this really powerful smell. It smelled like roses. And for a second, Moon thought to herself, oh my goodness, this whole thing was a setup. I'm not here to feed his pets. I'm here because he must have planned some really elaborate thing for Christmas Day for right now. And probably it has to do with lots of roses inside of his apartment. And so Moon was really excited by the time she got out front of Lee's apartment door, but before she used her key to open it up and just go in, she decided she would just call out for Lee, because she figured at this point, he's got to be in there. He knows I'm about to be surprised by this big thing. And so she calls out for Lee, but there's no answer. And so she knocks a couple of times to see if maybe she can get Lee to come to the door, but after knocking several times, there was no answer. So eventually, Moon used her key, she opened up the door, she swung it open, and she stepped inside of Lee's apartment, expecting to be wowed by whatever Lee had planned. But instead, when she looked around, she couldn't really understand what she was even seeing. Lee was nowhere to be found, but there were roses all over the apartment. However, these were not new roses. These were like several days old. Many of them were wilted and the petals were starting to fall off. And the water that all these roses were sitting in was very dirty. But really, there were like vases of roses everywhere on every surface. And right away, Moon started to feel really uneasy. It was like very creepy to be in this dark apartment where no one's inside of with just these weird flowers everywhere. And so without going any further into the apartment, Moon once again yelled out for Lee in hopes that maybe he was here, but again, he didn't come out of any of the rooms, so she knows she's alone. And so she called Lee on his phone to try to get an explanation for what she was looking at, but Lee didn't answer his phone. By this point, Lee's 3 cats were circling around Moon's legs because they were eager to be fed, and so Moon kind of stopped thinking about this strange flower situation and looked over at the cats' bowls and saw there was no dry food. They had eaten all of their food. And so Moon began walking over to the bowls when she realized Lee had not told her where he kept the cat food, and so she had no idea where it was. So Moon began opening all the kitchen cabinets, hoping to find this cat food somewhere, but she didn't. And so eventually she left the kitchen and she walked down this hallway inside of the apartment, and she found there was a skinny closet in the hallway that looked like a place where you would store cleaning supplies and vacuums and that sort of thing. So she reached down and tried to open it. She was able to turn the doorknob, but there was something inside of this closet that was making it really hard to open, like it was stuck on something. Now, again, Moon is kind of looking around this dark, dingy apartment that's filled with all these wilted roses, and she's feeling super uneasy, but she thought, I just want to feed these cats and just get out of here. And so Moon just grabbed that door handle and yanked as hard as she could, and she managed to pop it open. And for a second, Moon just stared at the inside of the closet, having no idea what she was even looking at. And then she started to scream. It would turn out virtually everything Moon thought she knew about Lee, her boyfriend, was wrong. 5 days earlier, after Moon and Lee had gotten into that horrible fight in the parking garage following the dinner with Moon's parents, Lee had made it seem like he was storming off to go hail a cab and drive home on his own. But in reality, after he stormed off, he waited for Moon to walk away and get a cab on her own, and then Lee just walked right back over to where he had parked his car in the parking garage. He got inside, turned it on, and began driving home. But on his drive home, he actually crashed into a taxi driver. Now, neither Lee nor the taxi driver were harmed in this accident, and both cars were still drivable, but Lee actually had a really big problem with drinking and driving. 9 years earlier, in 2013, when Lee was serving in the military, he was put in military prison for drunk driving. And then after he got out of the military, he was arrested 2 more times for drunk driving in 2018 and 2019. And so even though this accident with the taxi driver was very minor, Lee did not want to go to police and report this accident because if officials got involved, they would see that Lee has this horrible history of drunk driving and he would get in way more trouble. And so Lee convinced the taxi driver to just allow him to pay him privately for the damages in order to avoid getting officials involved. However, the taxi driver, who was open to this, demanded that Lee pay him in cash. He didn't want some sort of deferred payment plan. He wanted to be paid now. And so Lee said, okay, well then let's go to my apartment and I'll just pay you there. However, when the taxi driver and Lee got to Lee's apartment, they got in a fight over how much money Lee actually needed to pay the taxi driver for the damages. And eventually, Lee just kind of snapped and beat the taxi driver to death, and then stuffed his body inside of that cleaning closet in his apartment's hallway. And so that's what Moon had seen when she had opened up that closet. She saw the corpse of the taxi driver. And then after Lee had murdered the taxi driver, he stole the taxi driver's credit cards and his cell phone, and Lee would use the taxi driver's credit card to pay for all those lavish dinners and hotel stays and gifts over the next few days as Lee spoiled Moon for Christmas. And also during that time, Lee was using the taxi driver's cell phone to send messages to the taxi driver's family to convince them that he was still alive. Also, Lee went out and bought a whole bunch of bouquets of roses and put them all over his apartment to try to mask the smell of the rotting corpse inside of his closet. But this murder and Lee's horrible drunk driving were not his only secrets. Lee claimed he was from this very wealthy, successful family that owned all these amazing high-rises in South Korea, but that was all a big lie. Lee was not from a very successful family. He did not have any money. He basically just borrowed money from family and friends and then lied about how he acquired the money, claiming he was this big, successful, wealthy guy. Also, when the police in South Korea began investigating the taxi driver's murder, they discovered that Lee's apartment was not even his. It belonged to his ex-girlfriend, who was a bartender in South Korea who was in her 50s. Also, Lee's beloved 3 cats and dog that he talked about all the time, about how much he loved them and cared for them, well, those weren't his either. Those were his ex-girlfriend's. And as police continued their investigation into the murder of this taxi driver, they would eventually find traces of Lee's ex-girlfriend's blood inside of Lee's apartment, so his ex-girlfriend's apartment. And they would discover that Lee had murdered his ex-girlfriend, stolen her apartment, stolen her pets, and even took her cell phone, and to this day had been sending messages to her family to try to convince them that she was still alive, even though nobody had seen her and had no idea what was going on with her. Lee was ultimately arrested for 2 counts of murder, and he would quickly admit that he did kill the taxi driver and his ex-girlfriend. However, by this point, police had located the cell phone of a missing woman amongst Lee's things, and so they became very suspicious that he might have had something to do with this third woman's disappearance. However, to this day, Lee has denied having anything to do with this missing woman, and they still have no idea what happened to her. And so that case is kind of on hold. Despite how totally crazy this whole story sounds, the craziest part actually happened after Lee was arrested. Once Lee's crimes were being talked about all over the news, Lee became totally famous in South Korea because he was exceptionally good looking. On the news, they would play CCTV footage of Lee interacting with that taxi driver before he murdered him. And the only takeaway from lots of people in South Korea was, wow, this guy is so unbelievably attractive. He looks like an actor. Not, here's a guy who's about to murder someone. In fact, Lee became so popular in South Korea for being so beautiful that there became a real fear that Lee's ex-girlfriend, Moon, would become a target in some way. That maybe Lee's fans would blame her for putting their beloved Lee in prison and they might try to attack her. However, the police in South Korea did a really good job of masking Moon's identity, and so to this day, we believe she is still safe. And also, for clarity, Moon is actually not her real name. That is a pseudonym that we used to protect her identity as well. In the end, Lee was sentenced to life in prison for those 2 murders. "34-year-old Diane Newton King woke up before sunrise. She showered, she curled her bangs, she did her makeup, and then she dressed for work in the most professional women's fashion of the day. She put on pantyhose, a pencil skirt, and a blazer with the absolutely massive shoulder pads. It was the spring of 1990, and in Battle Creek, Michigan, Diane was one of the biggest names in town. Diane anchored the morning news show for Battle Creek's local TV station, WUHQ, which meant Most days of the week, Diane had to leave her house by no later than 4:30 a.m. As she shuffled around her two-story farmhouse in her pantyhose, trying to figure out where her briefcase was, Diane's husband, Brad, hollered up at her from the kitchen to tell her that breakfast would be ready in 5 minutes. Diane was thrilled. She had recently discovered that she was pregnant with their second child, and so she was constantly feeling hungry. Diane finally found her briefcase, then she slipped on her shoes and made her way downstairs into the kitchen. Her firstborn child, 2-year-old Marler, was sitting in his high chair chomping away on some apple slices. Diane kissed him on the forehead before sliding into her own seat at the kitchen table. 43-year-old Brad brought Diane a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. It was her favorite, and he made it for her every morning. Brad worked part-time as a criminal justice professor at the University of Western Michigan, but he liked to tell people that his real job was taking care of Diane and Marler. And for the most part, that was actually pretty true. Most days, while Diane was at work, Brad managed things on the home front. It was an untraditional dynamic for the time, and some of their friends jokingly called him Mr. Diane King, but Brad didn't mind. He was proud of Diane, and he was happy to support her this way. Diane scarfed down her breakfast, gave Brad and Marler a kiss goodbye, and then she grabbed her coat and raced out the door just as the clock hit 4:30 a.m. Outside the farmhouse, Diane paused for just a moment. She'd always wanted to live on a farm, and when she looked out across their property, with the cement silo on the left and the old red and white Victorian barn on the right, and the hundreds of acres of farmland and woods surrounding the house, she felt like she was really living her dream, even though the family didn't do any actual farming. But someday, Diane thought, maybe after the baby came, she'd leave the TV station to focus on her family and maybe even grow a few vegetables. But for now, all that would have to wait. It would be months and months before the baby arrived, and Diane had a lot of things she wanted to accomplish before then. So Diane, standing on her front stoop, took one more deep breath of clean country air, then she walked down the gravel driveway and hopped into her brand new Jeep Wagoneer. Diane then slowly drove down her long driveway, and when she reached the black mailbox at the end of the driveway, she turned right onto Divison Drive, the street she'd called home for more than a year now. And from there, she snaked her way through the neighborhood out to the highway. About 20 minutes later, Diane was sitting behind her desk, diving into yet another busy day of reading the news. Most days, when Diane arrived at the office, the first thing she would do is review her scripts for the day. Then she would anchor the morning news show, and then Diane and her staff would spend the rest of the day reporting and writing stories for future news segments. Diane worked a lot, and she worked really hard. She was actually a perfectionist, and she expected perfection from the people around her. And sometimes that perfectionism rubbed her colleagues the wrong way. But the people who actually watched her on TV, the audience, loved her. Diane was constantly being invited to meet local celebrities and attend different charity events around town. But despite how well things seemed to be going both professionally and personally for Diane, something very unusual would start to happen to her, and it would change her life forever. It all started with a phone call. Diane was at the office, sitting behind her desk, working on a story, when her phone rang. Now, remember, this was 1990, so Diane did not have a cell phone or even caller ID. All she had was a landline. So Diane's phone began to ring, and without hesitation, Diane picked it up because the people who typically called her on this line were her colleagues or sources or people who knew her personally. But this day, the caller was not any of those things. Instead, the caller was a fan. Diane didn't ask the caller what their name was, but based on their voice, Diane guessed that the caller was a male, probably in his 20s or 30s. He said he had been watching Diane on TV, and he was so inspired by her reporting, he was thinking about getting into broadcasting himself, and he wanted to know if Diane had any advice about how to break into the business. Diane was caught off guard that this guy got her number, but she was polite and professional, and ultimately recommended that he get enrolled in the communications department at the local community college. Diane even recommended specific classes she thought he should take. The fan thanked Diane for her time, and she wished him luck in his professional efforts, and then she hung up the phone, expecting never to hear from this guy again. But Diane would hear from him again. The fan started calling Diane's direct line on her desk on a very regular basis, sometimes as often as 3 times in a single week. And again, because Diane didn't have caller ID, she just kept answering his calls unintentionally. Despite being really annoyed by all these calls, Diane still remained very professional with the fan and continued to give him advice about how to do her job. However, the more he called, the more Diane sensed there was just something off about the guy. For one thing, she started to suspect that he wasn't actually interested in pursuing journalism. The questions he asked her didn't feel like the kind of questions you would expect from someone who was looking for guidance or information or even mentorship. They felt like an excuse to contact her, like he was making up questions just so that he could listen to her answer them. And there was something else that seemed kind of creepy. The more Diane heard from this guy, the more she noticed he had this very strange way of talking. It was slow and kind of slurred, almost like he was under the influence of some drug. Now, nothing this guy said to her was ever overtly rude or threatening, but after several calls, Diane couldn't help feeling like this guy could be a danger to her, and she had good reason to feel that way. For the last 2 years, every supermarket tabloid in the country had been running these stories about the rise in celebrity stalking cases. And now, the problem had gotten so serious that even the legitimate newspapers were covering these stories too. There were stories about celebrities getting threatening letters, and stories about their homes getting broken into, and some of these stories ended violently. Just 1 year earlier, an obsessed fan in Los Angeles, California, had shot and killed a young television actress on the doorstep of her own apartment. And it wasn't just the media that saw these stalking cases as being a big problem. Slowly, the government was also starting to realize that something had to be done. The problem was, nobody really knew what to do about it. In the 1990s, there were no anti-stalking laws anywhere in the country, and neither psychologists nor law enforcement could say for sure if it was better to confront a stalker head-on or simply ignore them. Diane wasn't sure if her situation with her fan would be considered a celebrity stalking case, but she was definitely feeling a bit scared of this guy and just wished he would leave her alone. So Diane consulted with the people closest to her, and everybody offered her different advice. One of her friends told her to be nice to the guy because who knows what would happen if she made him mad. One of her colleagues suggested that Diane just tell the guy to back off, but Diane could see that there was potential for problems in both of those situations. So Diane turned to Brad, her husband, not only because he was smart and an objective thinker, but also because, in addition to being a part-time professor of criminal justice, Brad also used to be a police officer. Brad, who was very concerned about his wife's stalking situation, told her that the safest thing she could do was simply cut off the guy's access to her. And the easiest way to do that was to set up some kind of arrangement with the receptionist at her work, who could then screen Diane's calls. If the guy couldn't get through to Diane, eventually, Brad figured, he would just give up and stop calling. The plan made sense to Brad and to Diane, so she decided to give it a shot. Diane talked to the receptionist at the TV station, and they worked out a screening system. The way it worked was every call that came in on Diane's direct line would actually first ring at the front desk with the receptionist, and the receptionist would answer the phone, and if it was Brad or a colleague or a source calling for Diane, they would get pushed through. But when the receptionist got a call from the fan with the slow, slurred voice, she would tell him that Diane was not available. And the screening system worked great for several weeks. The fan would call and would be immediately turned away before Diane ever had to speak to him. But eventually, the screening system failed. One afternoon, around the end of the summer in 1990, Diane was in the newsroom sitting at her desk filing some papers when her direct landline on her desk started to ring. Diane picked it up before the end of the very first ring. She said, "Hello, this is Diane Newton King." And when she heard the voice on the other end of the line, she was so startled she almost dropped the receiver. It was the fan. He said, "Hello, Diane." Immediately, shivers ran up Diane's spine. Before Diane could hang up, the guy told Diane that he liked the way she looked and that he wanted to meet her in person. Specifically, he said, "I want to go to lunch with you." Diane wanted to scream, but she was so flustered and so scared that she sort of just started stammering until finally she was able to compose herself enough to tell the guy that she appreciated the offer, but she absolutely could not meet him in person. Then she slammed the phone down and started sobbing at her desk. As she cried, everybody in the newsroom looked over and was very concerned. That night, when Diane came home, she told Brad about what happened that day, and Brad was livid. How could this guy get through to her phone? Why didn't the receptionist screen the call? Brad called the station and demanded answers. but no one at the station, including the receptionist, had any idea how this guy got through to Diane. The station told Brad they would look into the situation right away and make sure that from now on, absolutely no calls whatsoever would reach Diane's line unless they had first been screened. Now, it's unclear exactly what the station actually did to ensure that, but from that day forward, the fans' calls were always intercepted by someone at the station, and so Diane was protected from speaking with him. And after a couple of weeks, the fans' calls to the station started to slow down. And after a couple of months, the calls stopped entirely. And soon, Diane just kind of forgot about the fan and moved on to more important things in her life, like the upcoming arrival of her second child, a baby girl. And with this child, Diane was becoming more and more conflicted about what she wanted in life. Suddenly, her career just felt a whole lot less important than being home with her kids. And so she started talking more openly with her family and friends about potentially leaving the station after her daughter was born so she could be a stay-at-home mom and enjoy a simple farmhouse life with her family. But all of that excitement and optimism about the future would come to an abrupt end one night in the fall of 1990. On the night before Halloween that year, so about 5 months after the first fan phone call, Brad told Diane that he was going to be working late that night at the university and so wouldn't be home until later in the evening, which meant Diane would have to be on primary parent duty for Marlar that afternoon when she got home from work. Now, under normal circumstances, this would not be a big deal. Diane had done plenty of parenting on her own, and she loved spending time with Marlar. What made this night so different was that Diane was now 8 months pregnant. Her belly was massive, her hormones were raging, and her joints hurt so much she could barely walk. On top of all of that, Diane was in the middle of a big project at work that was totally stressing her out. Nevertheless, when she finished her shift at the station that day, Diane drove to Marlar's daycare, she picked him up, and then they headed home. By the time Diane turned onto her street, Divison Drive, Marlar was already passed out in the back of the car in his car seat, and Diane's body was really starting to ache. So when Diane turned into her driveway, instead of stopping the car and getting out to get the mail in the mailbox by the road, she simply pulled the car right up alongside the mailbox and reached out and collected the mail through her window. And after she had the stack of letters sitting on her lap, she began flipping through them. And right away, one letter caught her attention. It was in a typical white envelope, just like most of the other letters in her lap, but this one had no postage and nothing written on it, and it wasn't sealed. Diane opened the envelope, retrieved the letter inside, and then opened it up to read, and what she saw instantly terrified her. There was just one sentence on the page, but it wasn't written by hand. Each letter of this sentence had been cut out of a magazine and then scotch taped to the page, like one of those ransom letters you see in the movies. The sentence on this strange letter read, "You should have gone to lunch with me." Diane knew immediately that this letter was from the fan. Clearly, he'd found out where she lived, and he'd visited her house that day to drop it off. In fact, she realized with sudden alarm that this guy might actually still be in the area waiting for her to come home. In that moment, Diane forgot about everything else she had going on. She forgot about how much her body hurt and how tired she felt. She even forgot about the sleeping baby sitting right behind her. Diane just started screaming like a banshee. Then she threw the car into reverse, backed away from the mailbox, slammed on the gas, and drove away from her house as fast as she possibly could. About 15 minutes later, Diane showed up at her friend Cindy Acosta's house. Diane and Cindy worked together at the TV station, and Cindy was one of the first people Diane had reached out to for advice when this fan started calling her. When Cindy opened the door, Diane, who was carrying Marlar, practically collapsed into Cindy's arms. In between sobs, Diane told Cindy about this letter and how scared she was, and right away, Cindy said, "We have to call the police." The police showed up a few minutes later and escorted Diane back to the farmhouse to search the property for intruders, but they didn't find anyone. Still, Diane was too afraid to stay at the house alone, so the police brought her back to Cindy's house, where she waited with Marlar until Brad was finally out of his class and could come and pick them up. After word got out about this threatening letter, the Battle Creek community really came together to support Diane. Also, the TV station beefed up their security around the office, Diane's sister bought them a dog, and Brad installed motion-censored lighting outside of their house. But none of those things actually made Diane feel any safer. She just couldn't shake the idea that her fan was watching her everywhere she went. Her fear got so paralyzing that Diane literally just stopped going outside the house at all except to go to work. And when she did have to go outside, she used a system that she and Brad created to ensure she was never outside alone. Diane would call Brad to tell him exactly when she would be home from work. That way, when she arrived, Brad would be outside waiting for her. If it was too cold for Brad to just stand outside, he would leave a particular light on in the house that was visible from the outside. This light was a signal to Diane that he was in the house and that everything was safe, so she could hustle out of her car and come inside no problem. On days that Brad was not home, when Diane returned home, she would call a neighbor to come meet her outside of her farmhouse. And if for some reason the neighbor arrived late, Diane would literally just sit in her driveway inside her car, waiting for the neighbor to show up. But all of this fear and all of this hiding had started to make Diane's world feel very small, and she really didn't like that. So, after Diane gave birth to her second child, a blonde baby girl named Kateri, in November of 1990, Diane started trying to reconnect with her extended family. She started calling her sisters and mother much more often, and together, over the phone, the women would bond over the challenges and joys of raising their kids. And it was during this time, on these phone calls, that Diane started to talk more openly about her desire to leave the TV station altogether. She'd been thinking about it ever since she found out she was pregnant with Kateri, and now that Kateri was here, the whole thing felt much more real. Diane's extended family was very supportive and encouraging, and they pushed her to start leaving the house more often besides just going to work. They got her to start coming out to Detroit, where her extended family all lived, about 2 hours away from Battle Creek by car, so that she and her kids and the rest of the family could all participate more actively in each other's lives. And so, starting in late 1990/early 1991, every few weeks, after delivering the Thursday morning news break, Diane and her 2 kids would leave Battle Creek and head out to Detroit. They'd spend a few days with Diane's mother and sisters, and then on that following Saturday, they'd all head home. And on the night of Saturday, February 9th, 1991, about 9 months after the first call from that fan, this was exactly what Diane and the kids were doing, returning from her mother's. That night, Diane left Detroit a little after 4 p.m., so by the time she was pulling on to Divison Drive around 6 p.m., the sun was just beginning to set. Diane turned on her headlights, and when the King's black mailbox came into view, Diane tightened her grip around the steering wheel. It had been more than 3 months since she received the letter, but just the sight of that mailbox still filled her with dread. Diane turned onto the gravel driveway leading to the house, and as she made her way up the long, narrow path, she spotted the signal light on inside the farmhouse up ahead, meaning Brad was home and everything was safe, and she could get out of her car and just go inside. But, as Diane was about to find out, Brad was not inside the house, and it was definitely not safe for Diane to get out of the car. About 30 minutes after Diane pulled into the driveway and saw the signal light, a call came into the dispatch office at the local police department. It was Brad, and he was hysterical. He was so shaken up by what he had just seen that he could barely form a sentence. But he was able to eventually communicate with the dispatcher that he'd just found his wife lying in their driveway, not moving, and there was blood in her mouth. When the police arrived less than 10 minutes later, they found Brad sobbing and pacing around the driveway. Diane was just lying in the middle of the driveway next to her car, and their 2 kids, 2-year-old Marler and 3-month-old Kateri, were still sitting in the back seat of the car, crying uncontrollably. The reason Brad had left them in the car was because, as cruel as it seems, Brad knew from his work as a cop and as a criminal justice professor that even just opening the door to the car could potentially contaminate a crime scene. The responding officer walked right up to Diane and knelt down next to her. Even without much blood, it was obvious that Diane had suffered some sort of horrible injury and was definitely deceased. The officer spent a few minutes looking her over and eventually found the likely cause of death. There were 2 bullet holes in her body.
one in her chest and the other near her waistline. An autopsy would later reveal that the shot to Diane's chest had been the fatal one. It had caused so much internal damage that she had died within 3 minutes of impact. Initially, though, the police had no idea how long ago those shots had been fired. But when the officer touched Diane's body, he found that it was still warm, which meant her killer might still be in the area. Instinctively, the officer grabbed his radio and called for backup. Over the next 2 hours, a small army of investigators would descend on Divison Drive. They would search the property for fingerprints and evidence, and they would interview neighbors and potential witnesses, and after a little while, they would bring one of the best trackers in the state onto the property, a German Shepherd named Travis. When Travis arrived on the scene, the dog quickly locked onto a scent trail. The dog took off running from the farmhouse straight back into the forest behind the home. The dog ran through muddy, brushy fields, then he crossed a creek, and then he sort of just stopped, turned around, and headed back to the farmhouse, where a crowd of investigators and neighbors were beginning to form outside. At the time, Travis's handler assumed that the dog had just kind of lost the scent at some point in the woods, and that was why he had stopped, turned around, and just gone back to the farmhouse. But many months after that night, once the police had figured out what happened to Diane, they would look back at Travis's initial movements that night and realize the dog had not simply given up and returned to the farmhouse. The dog had just continued to follow the scent trail, which happened to stop somewhere in the middle of the woods, turn around, and then come back to the farmhouse. In fact, that night that Diane was discovered, the killer was standing right outside of Diane and Brad's home among the police and onlookers. After being arrested, Diane's killer did not confess to the murder, and so we don't have every detail of what happened in the final moments of Diane's life. However, based on several key interviews and pieces of evidence, this is what investigators believe happened to Diane. About an hour before Diane returned home from Detroit on the night she was killed, Diane's killer entered her farmhouse and turned on a particular light inside. The killer knew about the light signal system that Brad and Diane had created to make Diane feel safe, and now the killer was going to use that system to lure Diane into a trap. After switching the signal light on, the killer walked back outside and headed for the old red and white Victorian barn, which was situated in front of Diane and Brad's property, just to the left of the gravel driveway. There was no light in the old barn, but it didn't matter. The killer had been on this property many times in the past and had even practiced this particular route in the darkness when no one else was home. Inside the barn, the killer walked past the family's tractor and the many tools they left lying on the ground. The killer walked past the family's protection dog, but the dog just kind of looked up and didn't even bark. And then the killer reached the back of the barn and climbed a narrow staircase which led to a large, dusty loft area. The killer paused briefly at the top of the stairs. The floor of the loft was covered in straw, and at the far end of the loft, away from the killer, was a sliding door that was open just wide enough for what the killer needed to do. The killer walked over to this slightly open door and peered outside. From there, they could see the front of the farmhouse and the driveway and the spot where Diane parked her car, which was about 70 feet away. The killer checked their watch. It was getting late, which meant Diane would be arriving soon. So the killer got into position. The killer lay belly down in the straw facing the gap in the door, and then they reached out their arm to the right and stuffed their hand into some nearby straw. A moment later, they pulled out a weapon that had been hidden inside the straw, a .22 caliber rifle. About 20 minutes later, the killer spotted a pair of headlights coming down Divison Drive. The killer raised their rifle and looked through the scope, and sure enough, Diane was sitting behind the wheel of this car. As she turned onto her long gravel driveway, the killer flicked the rifle off safe. The killer held Diane in their sights as she drove up the driveway to the house. And when she got close enough that the killer could hear the gravel under her tires, the killer slipped their finger over the trigger. Diane reached her normal parking spot located off to one side of the driveway close to the house, and then she turned the car off. As she gathered her things inside of the car, the killer pushed the rifle's barrel through the small opening in the sliding door and focused their sights on Diane's car door. A moment later, that door opened up and Diane stepped out onto the driveway. The killer paused for a second, taking in the sight of the woman they had terrorized for months and months, calling her over and over and over again at work, and then leaving her that threatening letter in her mailbox. Then, the obsessed fan / Diane's killer squeezed the trigger. The bullet hit Diane squarely in the chest, throwing her body backwards onto the ground and tearing through her insides. After watching her fall to the ground, the killer quickly got up and, with the rifle in his hand, hustled back to the stairs, climbed down to the first floor of the barn, and then marched outside over to Diane's body. Everything was going exactly to plan until the killer spotted something he did not expect to see. Diane's 2 kids, Marler and Kateri, were still sitting in the back seat of her car. The killer began to panic. Why were the kids here? The killer was certain Diane's plan had been to leave her kids in Detroit for the weekend with her grandmother. But, as the police would later discover, the arrangements for the kids were changed at the last minute because one of the kids had gotten sick while they were at Diane's mom's house, so Diane just brought the kids home with her. But for Diane's killer, the kids presented a huge problem. Because after killing Diane, the killer had planned to drive away, get rid of the gun, and then try to establish some kind of alibi before Diane was discovered. But now there were these 2 kids in this car without heat in the middle of winter in freezing cold Michigan, and so if the killer left, the kids would freeze to death, and the killer was not trying to kill anyone except for Diane. So the killer changed plans. First, he turned away from the kids, crouched down, and then fired an additional shot into Diane's body to make sure she was dead. This was the shot that tore into her waistline. Then the killer turned and ran into the forest behind the farmhouse and charged through muddy, brushy fields across a creek to a spot where they were able to hide the rifle, and then the killer turned back around and ran back to the driveway of the King's house. When the killer got there, they ran up to the car window and looked inside and waved to the 2 kids and said, "Everything's gonna be fine, okay? Daddy's here. I'm gonna make a phone call and then I'll be right back." Then, Brad King, aka Diane's obsessed fan, aka Diane's killer, ran inside of his house that he shared with Diane and called the police. When they answered, Brad hysterically told him that he had just been out for a walk in the woods, and when he came back, he had found his poor wife lying in the driveway, not moving. It would turn out Brad King had been obsessed with Diane ever since the first day he met her. She was beautiful and funny and more ambitious than anyone Brad had ever met. Diane dreamed of becoming a news anchor, and Brad wanted to help make Diane's dreams come true. So, while Diane was off working her way up to the news desk, Brad spent most of his time working to make sure she had everything she needed to be successful. He cooked Diane's meals and ironed her clothes, he handled the shopping, and when the kids came along, Brad took care of them too. And as far as Brad was concerned, everything was working out great. Until one day, when Diane came to him and told him that she wanted to quit her job at the TV station so that she could stay home and raise the kids. In fact, she told him she was planning to leave the station the summer after Kateri was born. Diane hadn't formalized this announcement yet, but pretty much everyone in Diane's inner circle knew about her plans. But the problem was, if Diane was going to stay home, then Brad would have to be the family's primary breadwinner, and being a part-time professor just wasn't going to cut it. He would have to go out and find a full-time job, which was something Brad simply didn't want to do. He had grown to love not working very much, and he was not prepared to change that. However, when Brad voiced his concern to Diane about not wanting to work full-time, she was empathetic, but said it was really important for her and the kids that she be home with them, so he would just have to kind of accept it and get a full-time job. However, Brad did not accept this. Instead, he decided he would just kill Diane. And because of his background as a police officer and as a criminal justice professor, he was confident he could get away with it. Brad knew that whenever a woman got murdered, the male partner is almost always identified as a primary suspect. So Brad knew he would need to create another suspect to divert attention away from himself. This is when Brad came up with this obsessed fan concept. About 10 months before Diane's murder, Brad began calling Diane's TV station, pretending to be this obsessed fan. he would intentionally slur words and slow down his speech to make sure Diane could not recognize him. Then, about 5 months after that first call, when by this point everybody in town knew about Diane's stalker, Brad decided to up the ante. On the night before Halloween, Brad left that threatening letter in the mailbox. He used cutout letters so Diane could not identify his handwriting, and he did it because he knew that type of letter would be more intimidating because of its use in scary movies. And the letter worked. It terrified Diane, and most importantly, it brought more attention to this fake fan, to the point where the police were actively searching for this person. This obsessed fan had become so real that by the time Brad was ready to kill his wife, he felt certain that nobody would even look twice at him. But thanks to his kids still being in the car after he killed Diane, Brad had not been able to flee the scene like he had hoped, and so he had to come up with a story about how he had been walking in the woods that night and had returned home and came upon his wife in the driveway, and that's when he called police. But this story didn't make sense. Police discovered that Brad would have known exactly what time Diane was coming home that night because Diane's mom had called Brad and told him when Diane had left her house. And based on the system that he and Diane had, Brad would have known that Diane would have expected him to be at their house waiting for her when she arrived. So why would Brad choose to be out on a walk in the woods at the exact moment Diane was arriving home? Also, neighbors had just seen Brad carrying the .22 caliber rifle that was used to kill Diane. The gun was located in the creek behind their house, roughly where Travis the tracking dog had gone on the first night of the investigation. And in the barn, police also found a single shell casing from the shot that killed Diane. On December 13th, 1992, Brad was convicted of murdering his wife, Diane. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He never showed any remorse for her murder. Diane was buried in Detroit, near where her family lived. On her headstone, it says, "Beloved daughter, sister, mother." Diane was also, of course, a wife, but her family decided not to include that word.